Hello there, my name's Phil Williams and I would like to welcome you to Audio Angling, the podcast site of fishingfilmsandfacts.co.uk. Chatting to veteran all-round angler Brian Harris on the subject of today's fishing magazines, Mark Bowler's Fly Fishing and Fly Tying was his unhesitating first choice of top game fishing title based on its coverage, presentation and editorship. Quite an accolade coming from a man whose association with the titles Creel and Angling magazine are still talked about with nostalgic fervour some 40 years or so after their demise. That said, fly fishing and fly tying has at times trodden a rather precarious path. So, for its editor Mark Bowler, who I'm linking up with here at his busy Aberfeldy office, the obvious first question is to take us along that particular path from the magazine's conception to where it sits today.
It all happened by chance, really. I was keen on writing and I was into fisheries, but I'd seen an advert in one of these free local papers which was working as an assistant editor on a magazine which immediately I recognised as Salmon Trout and Sea Trout, which I'd already read that magazine and thought it was something special about it. There was something special about the magazine that came across as being quite detailed but also very involved, and it was quite serious, but it looked at fishing in a slightly different way, and it treated the reader as though they actually knew something about the topic and wanted to know more. So I applied for the job, although I had no experience whatsoever, and I got to meet Roy Eaton, who was the editor at the time, and he interviewed me, and I think he was very interested in the dissertation I'd done at Edinburgh when I was doing fisheries and wildlife there, and I'd done a dissertation on the autumn rod-caught salmon of the River Tweed, and he was very interested in that. And I realised later, when I knew Roy, that he had a particular interest in that topic of, it's basically to do with how grilse and autumn running fish are cyclical. And Roy had a great interest in that. And he often used to ask me about it many years later, about what I thought about this and that. So I think, unbeknown to me, that helped me in the interview. But as it happened, I didn't get the job. It went to somebody who actually had more experience than I did. But it was interesting that a year later, Roy came back to me, and the person who had the job had moved on, and he asked me if I was keen to take it on. And of course I was, so I started working with Roy from that point on. That was working on Salmon Trout and Sea Trout magazine, and when I got taken on, there was always this idea that there would be a new magazine which I would edit, which would encompass fly tying, but also stillwater fly fishing, which Salmon Trout and Sea Trout didn't really cover. And so, as we got through the work with Salmon Trout and Sea Trout, so we then started to look at how we were going to develop fly fishing and fly tying. And so it all happened sort of overnight, really, the whole thing, because I was saying, well, we really need to get this out in the spring, because that's when most stillwater people will be restarting their fishing. So I was pushing it from one end, and it was very much a sort of, the first issue was a lot of articles which we couldn't really use in Salmon Trout and Sea Trout, and which we were thinking, well, what can we do with these pieces? So we drew them together, and I remember one evening, David Goodchild, who was then the editor of Salmon Trout and Sea Trout, Roy had become consultant editor by then. We were sitting there one sort of sunny evening, I remember, till quite late, putting together the very last pages of Fly Fishing and Fly Tying before it went to print, and that came out as the very first issue in 1993. The setup of game fishing publications at the time, there were two sleeping partners involved, and they basically helped get Salmon Trout and Sea Trout up and running, and also fly fishing and fly tying. But unfortunately, they had a fallout in 1993, and this meant that they both wanted to get out of the company, which meant that somebody had to take it on. And during that time, both magazines were bought up and moved to Scotland. And from there, because I'd been to Edinburgh University and I had also spent time up in Scotland, and I liked Scotland, and I thought it was a good place to have a game fishing magazine. In any case, I moved up with the magazine as well. And so I ended up working on both Salmon Trout and Sea Trout and fly fishing and fly tying from the square in Aberfeldy, which is in fact where we are now. But in between there, between that being in the square in Aberfeldy there and being in the square in Aberfeldy today, there's quite a lot happened in between. And basically, what happened with Fly Fish and Fly Time was within 6 months of arriving here in Scotland, it was sold. And I had to apply for the job of editor to a group who now ran it from Milton Keynes. Now, I don't know if you know the Highlands of Scotland, but I just managed to move into a house in Kenmore, which is a beautiful little village on the River Tay. And my last thought was, you know what I want to do? I want to move to Milton Keynes. And so I was a bit loath to join up with the idea. However, at the time, what was happening in the publishing industry at that time, there was things like computers and modems were just started to come into it, and so they were quite happy for me to work from home and regularly go down to Milton Keynes and see them and oversee what was going on down there every month and work that way. So that's what I did. I started working from my back bedroom in my house overlooking Loch Tay, and it was great. I mean, I used to work away and I used to do some work and fish, and then I would fish and do some work at night when it was dark. I basically lived a life of fishing and putting together a magazine and occasionally going to Milton Keynes, and it was really good. And I could sit in my office and tap away on what was then a big sort of square computer and watch ospreys feeding in Loch Tay, and then I could actually watch seagulls circling around taking olives and think, it's about time to get out there, and suddenly I could nip off and have a few hours fishing and then come back to the computer. It was idyllic. But unfortunately, it was too idyllic, and the company went into liquidation. I got summoned down to Milton Keynes to say that the police had moved in and seized all the computers, and I don't know why, but apparently I was quite important. When anything went wrong down there, I had to be summoned down there and see if I could sort it out. Of course, I had no idea what was going on. And so when the liquidators moved in, I thought, well, here's a chance to actually buy the magazine again, because I tried to buy it in the first instance when the sleeping partners fell out before. I couldn't get it then, and I spoke to the liquidator, and he said, well, I put in an offer for it and managed to compile an offer for it, and he said, oh, that's a pretty good offer, you should feel pretty pleased with that. And so I started making my plans, but of course I never got the phone call to say I'd got it, because during this time another chap had bought it. I imagine he put in a lot bigger offer than I had, because he'd just sold 6 months previously a group of magazines which he was involved in the building trade, and he'd got a huge amount of money together from that, and he'd then sailed around the world, got bored, and decided he was going to get into leisure magazines, and Fly Fishing and Fly Time was the first one he saw come up. So he put in a bid against me, and inevitably he outbid me. So he rang me up on the Monday after I'd found out on the Friday I hadn't got it, and he asked me to edit it, and I said I wasn't that keen, because I was getting fed up of working for different people every 6 months. And I said, there isn't the money you think there is in it. In 6 months' time, I'm sure you'll want to get rid of it, and I'll be down on my offers again. I won't know what I'm doing again, and it's very unsettling, and I think I'll just set up my own magazine. I said, don't do that. He said, I'm not going to sell it. And in between times, I'd spoken to one of my contributors called Robert Spake, who is a vicar, but he also trained to be a lawyer. And he said to me, he said, well, you know, Mark, he said, you could easily work for this chap, and you could say to him, well, if he is going to sell it, just have something in your contract which gives you first refusal on buying it when and if you think he's going to sell it. So I said this, and the chap's name was Dennis Taylor, and Dennis said, well, I'm not going to sell it. And I said, well, that's great, we can have that in the contract, because if you aren't going to sell it, we can put something in the contract that it doesn't matter if it's never going to come up. And he said, yeah, okay, we'll do that. So we sorted it all out, and 6 months later he rang me up, and he said he's still interested in buying it. And I said, of course I am. And he was really good he was exceptional, he was a great guy, and he sold it to me for less than I'd originally bid for it in a liquidator's auction. And by then, you see, what he'd realised was that He'd collected a few other magazines on the way, and mainly auto magazines. And I imagine they were probably taking more money in a month than Fly Fish and Fly Time were taking a year. And I think I could see that it was coming further and further down his list of priorities. So it was very good of him to actually take on board the comments that I'd made and we'd discussed 6 months previously. And so eventually I went down to Kent, where Dennis was based, gave him the cheque, and I picked up. It's funny, if you ever buy a magazine, you don't really buy anything. You buy a title and that's it. And so I picked up this cardboard box, and it had some old letters in it and some old transparencies, and there were a few bits of paper. That was it, really. And I then drove back up to Scotland with the cardboard box and thought, right, here we go. And so I just carried on doing what I was doing, but I had to negotiate with printers to get the whole thing printed. I had to negotiate with the bank to get the money, and off we went. We were off on a slightly different road, doing the same job, but having a lot more responsibility. And it is quite a responsibility, because when you print an issue, you don't get paid for that straight away. You wait for the sales to come back, and then you're actually paid there and then. So by the time you're paid for your first issue, you've already printed 2 issues. So you've lashed out tens of thousands of pounds on the first 2 issues, and you haven't actually received any money in. There were a few nights when I'd wake up thinking, what happens if we don't sell 1 copy? It is quite unnerving when you first start, but we did sell copies, and we certainly kept ourselves busy enough to then start to develop the magazine from that small bedroom. And within a few months it got very difficult to actually try and get into the bedroom, because there were 2 computers in there, 2 desks, and filing cabinets and boxes, and it became a sort of gymnastic competition to actually get in and sit in front of your desk and get working at it. But it was very good fun. And certainly it kicked off well.
What makes this story even more remarkable is the fact that your personal pathway into journalism started with nothing more than you simply fancied giving it a try. No formal training. Quite literally a case of flying by the seat of your pants and learning as you go.
I suppose it all stemmed from the fact that when I was at school, I was going on to I'd done my O-levels, and I wasn't really sure what I was going to do. My dad was in education, and he was very keen for me to go on and do my A-levels at school and then go to university. But I thought, well, I'm not really interested in doing anything like that. I want to get out in the wide world and earn some money. And he was quite canny. He then discovered that Edinburgh University did a fisheries management course. So he said, you do realise that if you got these grades at A-level, you could go there. So I thought, well, that sounds good. Okay, so suddenly, having been pretty useless at biology and not very good at chemistry, I really started to work at them, and I got the required grade. So I did wildlife and fisheries management up in Edinburgh, and we did an honours course in fisheries in the last year there. It was basically ecological sciences with an honours degree tacked onto the back of it. And so when we came out of there, right in the middle of the recession. It was a great course to go on, but when we came out, there were absolutely no jobs to be had. Probably a little bit like now. So everybody on our course was keen to get into fisheries, but there was just nothing out there, and so you'd have to really look. And I remember one of the jobs that came up at the time would have been working on the salmon project on the Thames, and I remember applying for that and thinking I've got a really good chance. And I got a letter back saying, thanks for your inquiry, there were 650 applicants for the job. And so I then just thought, I remember going to think, well, I'm going to struggle here, so I might as well go and do something for myself. And in the meantime, I'd worked up in Scotland at a field centre. That was brilliant fun. It taught me a lot about Scotland, and it taught me a lot about people and nature, and certainly I would say that working out there, that's when I sort of really fell in love with Scotland, because as a place and as an environment, and also I was fishing up there as well. And so after that, I got that job because I worked in a fiberglass factory making windsurfer boards for that. And I think because I was doing that, it was journalistic who gave me the job up in Agers Field Centre. He said that was one of the things that he noticed, that I was actually working at the time. Very few people who applied at the time for that job were actually working. So that made a difference. So I did that for a year, and then when I came down, I got a job at a fish farm. I worked in a fish farm down in Stow-on-the-Wold, and there we hatched out mainly rainbow trout fry and reared on a few rainbow trout fry and some rainbow trout for the table. And whilst I was there, I dug a lake, and we made a little fishery there at the back of the fish farm, which is still there. Just a small stillwater trout fishery which I used to run, and that was quite successful. Had its own difficulties because it was quite shallow and it had problems with weed in the summer, but it was good grounding and it was very good fun doing it, and you learnt a lot about fishermen and fisheries and trout fishing. So enjoyed it very much, but also at the same time I was encountering people who were working with coarse fish, and they were netting coarse fish and selling coarse fish to angling clubs. So I was working a lot with people that were doing that, and one of the guys I was working with, Richard Morgan, he said, you know what, Mark, all the lakes I net for coarse fish, nobody ever seems to think about eels that are in there. At the time there were a lot of eels. I know we've got a problem with eels now, but at the time eels were everywhere, and I knew certain people fight net for eels, but I didn't hear much about that business. So I bought some fikes and started eel netting and trapping for eels, and there's a huge market for eels, because I went down to Billingsgate and spoke to guys down there, and I would say, well, are you interested in eels? And they would say, how many tons have you got? And you thought, crikey, because I was thinking of 50 to 100 pounds of eels, not tons. And so there were all sorts of things going on at the time with fish, and the more I did it, the more I got into netting fish, and we were using big seine nets in reservoirs and gravel pits all the way around the country. And again, very exciting stuff, because when you go out netting, you really don't know what you're going to catch. One time I caught a 36.5 pound pike. We caught huge carp once, big shoals of tench. But that you would also go, I remember once I went up to Scotland and fished in this big loch, Kilburney Loch, and it's made out of clinker, a lot of clinker from the steelworks there. I remember we got something big in the net there, and it was this massive anchor. It took me ages to get it in. It was a massive anchor. You never really knew what you were going to turn up with. It's a good life, but it's very hit and miss. So I needed something a little bit more stabilising, I suppose, for income. And I knew I'd learned about smoking fish when I was at the fish farm, and I started to bring down salmon from Scotland and smoke them in a smokery that I built from an old space heater. So these big space heaters, which would be used for heating a big warehouse or something, and I had help from friends who were good with electric, so we were putting heating elements into it and thermostats and welding on smoke drawers and fans, and we had chimneys on it, and it worked really, really well. And through doing that I managed to supplement what I was doing by providing I used to do a lot of fresh smoked salmon at Christmas. In the end I built a small smokery, and my brother, he's a bit of a handyman, he came and plastered it all and we fitted it all out. After I'd seen Roy and I hadn't got the job, and I decided, well, I've got to really do something positive with what I'm doing now, so that's when I fitted out the smokery and decided I would probably go down that route of getting into smoking fish. But that didn't actually quite work out, because Roy then came back to me a year later and said, are you still interested? And of course I was. And so I then went to work with him and tried to balance the netting and the smoking and the assistant editing all together, and of course the assistant editing won out in the end, and the rest is history.
Can we complete the historical trilogy with your angling apprenticeship? Firstly, how you got into fishing, then your pathway through to the world of game fishing.
My start in fishing is probably typical, but I don't know. But I can remember the very first day I went fishing, and I would have been 7. And I can remember it because I went with my brother, who was 2 years older than me, and we went down to the river, and I bet we didn't catch any fish. I'm absolutely sure we didn't catch any fish because I would have remembered it. But I do remember coming back and being totally and absolutely smitten by what I'd just done. And although subconsciously I must have just thought, I am a fisherman, that is what I want to do. And I remember my brother went, a few weeks later he was going to go fishing again, and because I couldn't swim, my mum decided I couldn't go, and I was furious because I couldn't go fishing. And I remember my brother going and I couldn't go, and being very upset that I couldn't go. But during that time we just used to go down to the River Welland and we would fish, but we were useless fishermen. We would catch minnows, but I just loved it. And I think it was probably to do with being outside and being by a river and just the environment and the people I was with and the anticipation, I think, of catching a fish. It's very hard to explain, but I know that I was totally drawn to it as soon as I'd done it once. And I would say I went fishing for ages without really catching anything. It would only be when I started fishing with, say, my mate Dave Thorpe. His father used to take us, so he would show us how you would set up for strep pegging or just different float styles and float fishing. So it would be that really that showed me how you could present bait at different depths and how you would fish back eddies or streamy water or flat water or whatever. And so then it became much more of a thinking man's sport, and then you started to read more about it and different setups, and you suddenly realised there was a lot more to it. And we would go on holiday. We would always go fishing when we were on holiday. And my dad wasn't a fisherman, and he was so patient, and he would just sit there and untangle line, and he would take weed off hooks. He was there all the time, and yet he wasn't a fisherman. I never had the chance to ask him whether he was completely bored or not, but he did put in hours and hours of very patient work. And you probably could see that we were both my brother and I were really, really enjoying it. We loved it. Once, say, we were sea fishing. I remember we went sea fishing off St David's Head in Pembrokeshire when we were on holiday there. And I remember hooking what would have been a big pollock off a sheer cliff. And I remember my dad lying on the cliff looking over the precipice going, it's massive, Mark, it's massive, Mark. And my rod was a fiberglass rod that was yellow, and I remember it bending at the handle, and I was winding for all I was worth, but of course I couldn't get the fish off out of the water, which was probably about 25 feet below me. And so obviously the fish in the water was fine, but as soon as I tried to lift it out of the water, it was just physically impossible. And eventually the spinner that I was using pinged out of its mouth and flung itself. I can remember it now. I can remember it flinging up into the air and reaching exactly 25 feet above me, and then coming back down, and I can still remember the chink of the spinner landing on the rock right by my feet, and me thinking, I've lost it. And I never saw it. My dad saw it, and he said it was a big pollock, and his arms were outstretched to tell me how big it was, but I hadn't seen it. And I think that was yet another step in me being a lifelong fisherman, because I was completely hooked, and all I wanted to do was go back there and try and catch it. But I never did. That's how I got hooked as a fisherman, probably. I was very lucky. I'd always read things about fly fishing and seen them in catalogues about fly fishing. I didn't really understand it at all. but I was gathering information on fly fishing that I had no conception of it. And again, I was very much on my own. I mean, you're talking 40 years ago, and so all I had, I do remember, I'll come back to it in a minute, but all I had to learn to cast was an Abu catalogue. I remember that, and just a stickman drawing of how to do it. But it was really the fact that Ibrook Reservoir, which is in Northamptonshire, was just 2 miles down the hill, a bike ride down the hill, and we had, I'll say in inverted commas, poached the river for trout when we were younger, and there were always trout in the river, so we knew how to catch them by there. So I suppose it was a natural thing to think, well, where are all these trout coming from? And we enjoyed catching trout, and so we knew they'd come out of the reservoir, but we also knew that you had to fly fish for them. You couldn't use a worm or a spinner or a dead minnow on Ibrook Reservoir. And so I remember gathering up some poor gear, a fly line, a reel and a rod, and I was lucky that I had a friend who was also interested. He was a very good angler, my mate, Mike Duxbury, and he and I decided we would try and go fly fishing and see what it was like. And I remember the very first day we went, because I didn't have any waders, so he said, I've got a friend who's got some waders. He said, and he produced these waders which I've never ever seen before, and I hope I never see them again, but they were made of canvas. So we went, and because it cost quite a bit, it cost a lot more to fly fish for trout than it did to coarse fish, so we were very aware of the cost of a day's permit. So we went at dawn, and so it was dark when we actually got there, and put these canvas waders on. I remember wading out and realising the canvas waders didn't actually work, and so by the time dawn had broken I was soaking wet, and we weren't managing to cast very far either. I was beginning to think fly fishing really wasn't for us, but because we're so close, I went home, got dry again, then we went back down again, and we got a boat, and we thought this will be the thing, we can get a boat and we can fly fish off the boat because it won't matter how far we can cast. So we booked the very last boat, and I remember it was an old wooden heavy clinker built thing, and by this time the wind had got up and we couldn't row either, and we got caught in the wind, and the wind was blowing onto the dam, and we spent all morning rowing, and we never got the rods out at all. We just rowed and rowed and rowed, and we gradually drifted across the reservoir whilst we were rowing, and we ended up, and all we were trying to do was row away from the dam, because we thought we were going to get smashed to pieces on the Ibrook Dam. So we just kept rowing and rowing and rowing, and we ended up on the far side of Ibrook Reservoir, clinging onto a willow tree to stop ourselves from going any further into the dam and getting smashed up. So we had our lunch clinging to a willow tree, and then we said, look, we've got to get this sorted, we'll have to get across the other side of the reservoir. So we decided that perhaps we needed to be pulling together on the oars, which we probably weren't doing. So we pulled all the way back across, and we managed to get back into the sheltered water on the other side. And by this time it was probably about 1:30 in the afternoon, and we still hadn't cast, and we'd been there since dawn. So we put the anchor down, and then we realised we hadn't tied the anchor on properly, and we'd lost the anchor, and so I had to go back to the lodge and get another anchor. So it was probably about 2:30 by the time we were firmly anchored in this bay, in the shelter, in the lee of the hills, and we started fishing. And I'll never forget that Mike actually hooked a fish on a muddler minnow. I can remember it as clear as day. And I remember one of the guys who was fishing off the bank. It was one of those days where you could hear what people say, you know, it drifts across the water. He said, bloody hell, I don't believe it, they've caught one. And he must have been watching us all day, rowing. So Mike's playing this fish, and even at that time we're still very superstitious, and the superstition is that if you take a net with you then you'll never catch anything. So we haven't got a net, And so Mike's playing this trout, probably about £1.25, and we've no net to land it. And I don't know if you've ever been in a boat where you're trying to land a fish on a fly rod, but without a net, it's incredibly difficult. And you can't grab the fish, you can't. So suddenly we've got this dilemma of having a fish on and not being able to get it in. So I eventually landed it in the baler. And we were so chuffed, really, really pleased with our whole exploit. But I know a lot of people were watching us thinking, what the hell are those guys doing? But, once you've caught one, then you realise that you can do it. And like I say, we were then hooked. I do remember that once I'd started fly fishing, and very, very soon after that, I was fly tying as well. I rarely went coarse fishing after that. I think the fact that I was trout fishing and I could take the trout home to eat it, and the fact that the trout was eating a fly that I could imitate, made a lot of sense to me. And I think the imitation side of it, the science of it, the science of the trout, and analysing what it's eating and trying to replicate what it's eating with fur and feather, was really the thing that caught my imagination, and it still does. I cottoned onto that pretty quickly, and we were tying flies very, very soon after catching our first fish on Ibrook. And again, at the time, getting hold of materials, the right materials, very, very difficult. So we would constantly be scratching around for the right material and trying to find the killing fly and fish it in a killing manner, which wasn't always easy.
As an East Midlands boy, now based at the heart of some of the best wild game fishing in Scotland, presumably in those early days of your editorship, you would have been on quite a steep learning curve, in addition to the journalism.
Yeah, certainly coming out to Scotland, it was a culture shock. As a fisherman, it was definitely a culture shock, because by then I thought, yes, I can cast a fly, I can imitate flies. If I had a season ticket at Rutland Water, I thought, yeah, I was pretty well sussed. And I had various lessons when I first arrived up in Scotland, which showed that I actually knew nothing at all about fly fishing. It was a minuscule amount that I knew. Certainly when I first started it, I came up to Aberfeldy and I joined the local angling club straight away, and I would come into work and I would go back to the digs I was staying with. I'd have something to eat, I'd watch a bit of Wimbledon, and then I'd go down to the river. And I couldn't catch anything, and I knew there were fish there were odd fish moving. So started a very long association with river fishing, which is a totally different aspect to still water fishing in many, many ways. And yeah, it's yet another steep learning curve. Still water fishing gives you certain basics, but it certainly doesn't give you everything at all to do with river fishing for the same trout that you were fishing for in still water. And obviously, being on the Tay, you then also have the opportunity to salmon fish. And salmon fishing, again, I remember fishing for salmon on the Tay for almost a complete season, and I never saw a salmon. Not on the end of my line. I did see one jump at the very end of the season. And it was only then that I realised that actually on this part of the Tay's quite a cold river. It's a big river, it's a cold river. You don't often see salmon jump on the Tay, not on the high stretches. And so now that doesn't faze me at all with salmon fishing. But it's the conditions and the state of the river and the time of the year and even the time of the day when you're actually tuned into thinking, yeah, I think this is a good time. And so you do learn a huge lot by living on a river and learning a river, and it's just yet another experience. That I think that's the thing about fly fishing, is that you never ever know it all. And even now, I think another thing I do like about fishing per se is I don't particularly like being guided to fish. I like to try and find them myself. And I think the wider experience you have with fish, the more you can bring that into your day out if you're visiting a place which you don't really know, or sometimes a place you do really know. You can draw on that experience and think, how am I going to catch a fish here? Where are they going to be? And what are they going to be feeding on? And that is again is part and parcel of the challenge of fishing for me, and I really enjoy that. I don't mind not catching anything. Well, I do mind not catching anything, and that's why I do my utmost to try and catch something from wherever I am. But I do enjoy that side of it, and it's the same with salmon. Or obviously I had this huge leaning towards sea trout as well, which I got through Hugh Fulkers's reading about sea trout. I read everything about sea trout, but I'd never actually done it. When I first moved up to Scotland, and that's when I first really started to get to grips with sea trout fishing. And of course, I used to fish on the west coast quite a bit, where nobody else went, and I used to fish in the sea, and that's a great fishing for sea trout, which you just can't get anymore now, because we all know of the problems on the west coast of Scotland with fish farming basically devastating the stocks on that side. But that all stemmed from me and my brother going up there when we were probably about 8, and we experienced we sat on the banks of the River Ewe, I remember, at the sea pool there, and I still to this day have never ever seen such a run of fish going up a river. I didn't realise that's what they were doing, because all I was thinking is, why can't I possibly catch one of these fish, because there were thousands of them running up the river, and I had them jumping over my rod, jumping over my line, jumping over my float. None of them were being caught, and there must have been about 20 people fishing for them. But even to this day, I don't think I've ever seen a run of fish like that, and sadly you don't get that anymore on the west coast. But I'm deviating off the point. Yeah, I think with Scottish fishing, I mean, the other part of Scottish fishing that I really enjoy is the wild trout lochs of Scotland, of which there are thousands of them. And when I was at the field centre, I first started to fish those, and they were completely different then. You really need to know somebody who owned the loch in order to get permission to go there. So there were a few that I could get in on those lochs, and I knew the people to ask, and I'd go up there and fish them. And you certainly learn that you don't fish them in the same way as you do a reservoir, and you basically just keep moving. You don't stand still. I remember the first loch I fished up there, I just stood in the same place on a point, because that's what you do in a reservoir. Yes, you might catch one fish, but you need to keep moving on wild Scottish lochs. And so again, you have to work out what is happening and what you're fishing for, and try and get your best methods sorted out. What also developed would be something like Bruce Sanderson's book, which he realised that there were all these trout lochs out there with trout in, some of them really good lochs, but nobody knew how to access them. And so his book, Trout Lochs of Scotland, was a revelation to me, because it meant that no matter where I went in Scotland, I could look at a piece of water and look it up in a book and find this loch, and I could find out how to fish it, how to get access to it. And basically, once you've got the access to it, it's very, very cheap. But it's also, you've got this feeling that nobody's ever fished there before, because some of these lochs are miles from the road. So it's kind of a hiking, orienteering, fishing, camping expedition. But there's always the chance that you might meet a wild brown trout that nobody's ever fished for. So yeah, I think that part of Scottish trout fishing is something which you have to do it to actually really appreciate it, because you are totally out in the wild and it's just you and the trout. And some of the settings of these lochs are fantastic, and some of the wildlife you see is just amazing. You're really privileged to be out there, but the fishing can be stunning, and in some places you can catch huge amounts of fish. Other places you might not catch so many, but you might catch a really good wild brown trout, which is highly coveted. So I always think Scottish fishing is much underrated. I just wish it could be probably a bit more highly valued by politicians out there who don't seem to think it has any value at all. And perhaps because it doesn't actually cost much, perhaps that's why it's undervalued. But certainly as part of an experience of going out there, it's well worth doing.
As I said in the intro, Brian Harris, who also contributes to fly fishing and fly tying, put your operation right up there at the top of the publishing pile, which must be very rewarding, especially considering the history we've already discussed regarding the title's early days and your route to the helm. What is it then that sets your magazine apart from its competitors in the same field?
It probably boils down to the fact that the philosophy behind it. I remember when I started it up, my philosophy had been affected by books by people like Brian Clark, Gordon Fraser, Arthur Cove. They'd all looked at fly fishing in a way which made sense to me, which was all about imitating the food that the fish were eating. Up until that sort of era, very much a lot of trout fishing was fishing wet flies or lures. Sinking lines were just coming in, but lures, I remember when we first started fishing, they were the things you used. But when you analysed what was in a fish, you knew that they weren't feeding on lures, they were feeding on beetles, or they were feeding on buzzards, or they were feeding on bloodworm, or they were feeding on fry. And so you tended to think, well, if I imitated that, surely they would eat it. And so I was doing my own imitation work, not very successfully, but I was trying it because it made sense to me. And I think when I first started the magazine, it was very much to try and get that philosophy across about the imitation side of fly fishing, which it wasn't the mainstream idea. And since then, I mean, obviously stillwater fishing's developed a lot onto the imitation side, and we've always steered down that imitative channel. But I've also tried to, I suppose, look for things which are not as straightforward as they might seem. They might look at the other angles of fly fishing, and there's always an angle, and there's somebody always has something to say. And I think that's the thing, is fly fishing is such a diverse subject, and it's a very individual subject as well. It doesn't matter who you talk to, somebody will always come up with a theory or something that is of interest, which you think, yeah, you know what, that makes sense, and then you'll go away and try it. And I think that's probably experimentation, and trying different things is part of philosophy that I quite enjoy, and I hope the readers do as well. And also, obviously, with the tying of the flies, because I've got such an interest in that, and I know when I first started tying, I mean, I learned such a lot. I was so privileged when I started to meet people like Davey Watton and John Goddard. These guys were showing me stuff which I'd seen, but I couldn't understand. And when you actually see somebody do something as like a maneuver or use a material in a certain way, when you actually see it, you completely understand it. But you have to see it in the right way. So again, I suppose that would be another thing where I'd be trying to get across in the magazine exactly what I wanted to know from that person. And I suppose that's where the philosophy comes from.
Would it be fair to say that most anglers these days are not prepared to put in an apprenticeship and learn for themselves such things as watercraft, with your competitor magazines through the content both pandering to and perpetuating that situation?
I do believe there is that apprenticeship that I served. I mean, I can remember, honestly, Phil, who would want to go down to Rutland Water and spend 13 consecutive evenings not catching anything, because I was trying to imitate what the fish were feeding on? But unfortunately, there were very few fish around because it was high summer when I was trying to do it. I now know that. But I think for me, it is that element of trying to draw on your own resources and your own experiences to find fish and to work them out. I enjoy that. But I can certainly understand why somebody would want to go and say, look, I've got my one day, I really want to go fishing. But the problem with fishing is, people will say there's more to fishing than catching fish, and there is. But at the end of the day, a fisherman doesn't like to go home and actually think, but I haven't caught anything. He wants to catch a fish. And so That's the conundrum that the fisherman has, is that the learning curve is basically, you have to take it on board that you're not going to catch anything, because sometimes it just doesn't work. But you can learn from a blank, you really can, but unfortunately you have to go through the blank before you actually learn it. So yeah, I think there is a lot of instant fishing, more instant fishing around, but I think that's just tailoring to what people want. I mean, these days there's so many guides around that you can get, which I think is great. I think it's fantastic that people can learn about a water very quickly from a guide, because I think that will tune them into the fact that they get to know the water, and they get on the water, and they have success. And success, no doubt, you know, I learned that as a fishery manager when I was down on my little lake down in Stow on the Wold. A fisherman won't come back, and he won't keep fishing if he doesn't catch fish. And yes, there is more to fishing than catching the fish, but catching the fish is very, very important to a fisherman. And so I think probably because I'd spent such a long time when I was younger just being by a river and learning about fish, but not even realising I was learning about them, yeah, it is a useful thing to have. I wouldn't want to do it any other way, but it's definitely changed these days. The great thing about it is that I can still tailor my day to go and suit the style of fishing that I like. I don't have to go and fish for a bunch of stockfish down by the aerators, for instance. I can go and look and see if I can find something on a dry fly, and if I can't, then that's tough. I might nip back to the aerator later on.
Sticking with the instructional role that the media in its various guises has to play across the whole angling scene, would it be fair to say that too much reliance is now placed on being handed information on a plate, to the extent that anglers are no longer willing to serve any sort of apprenticeship anymore?
I think you have to think about something that has interested you and made you think, and it has inspired you to do something, or you've overcome a problem. It's less so about just putting down an experience. I think the key is knowing if it's a slightly different experience and saying, this was different and this is why, and trying to identify why it was different. And I suppose that's probably one of the keys, is to understand what's gone before and look and say, I've learned something here, and I think I've got something for other people to learn from. And I think when people read this, then I think they're going to benefit from it. And I do know that sometimes I'm editing a piece, and when I'm reading it through it, I'm thinking, oh yeah, this is interesting, and I then think, you know what, I might try this. And so I think if I'm doing that when I'm reading the piece, I'm thinking, well, this is a really good piece, because I'm thinking that I should try this. So I imagine other people will be out there thinking, that's a good piece, I think I'll give that a go. And I think if you can inspire a reader to actually not just read it, but actually think about how he approaches his next day out, then I think you've probably achieved something. So that's really what I think the key is. That's what you've got to come up with.
So on the basis of what we've already talked about, how would the job description read for anyone wanting to get a piece of written copy past you?
People like Malcolm Greenhouse, for instance. Just before this interview started, I was working on his copy. Malcolm is extremely knowledgeable, but he's also fun. And I've just been working on his piece, where every World Cup now that comes up, because he hates football and he gets downhearted by England's fervour about how well they might do, and then he gets really downbeat when they all fail. Being Malcolm, he realises that, of course, when a country's in World Cup fever and when there's a big game on, there's nobody fishing in the best spots and the best rivers and the best still waters at the time, because they're all watching television. And so he goes fishing, and so he does a piece where he goes fishing during the big games of the World Cup, and then he reports on it. And I've just been working on that piece. So that is a fun piece by Malcolm, but he is extremely knowledgeable. I remember when we first talked about the magazine, he did a series on all the different insects and what the life cycle of those insects were and how that applied to fly fishing. So, and he's like an encyclopedia, Malcolm is. You can ask him anything and he will know the answer. He doesn't look it up in a book, he knows the answer. Often I'm looking at something and I think, I better just check that, and I look it up. No one doesn't need to do that, he knows it. So something like that is a good guy to have, because I can always bounce stuff off him and say, what do you think about this? And I know his knowledge is extremely good, and also it's on tap. I've got Magnus Angus, he's a tackle geek, really. He loves gear, and I think that's great, because we've got a lot of readers who do love their gear, and so he goes into the intricacies of that gear. And he's also a photographer, which is useful, so he can photograph the bits of the gear that he knows are going to appeal to people, and so that's useful as well, because he can give an up-to-date appreciation of the new rods, or the latest rod actions, or the latest line profiles are actually designed for and what they're trying to achieve. And then having Oliver Edwards write for me was brilliant. I mean, Oliver wasn't just a very good writer. He used to write, again, almost as if he was talking, but also great knowledge, great entomological knowledge, and also fantastic flies. But he was also a draftsman, so he could draw what he was tying. And I think those series of articles that Oliver did were just outstanding. And the flies he was producing, they were flies that I would be putting the piece together and then taking the drawings home and tying the fly from the drawings before anybody else saw them. It's just great to have that sort of person writing for you. And then you've got so much experience out there, and you're talking about the Brian Harrises, the Peter Lapsleys, who is unfortunately not with us anymore, but they had so great insight into what is currently happening in fishing, and what are they using, what little nuances are they bringing in, which they think, this is a minor point, but I think it's important. And again, when you read it, you think, that's a good idea. Or they've got an opinion about something, which is, because they're so experienced and because they've seen it, when you get an opinion, you think, wow, they know all the background, and they're putting together an opinion which actually means something here. They're actually inspired to write it, and they want people to know that this is what they think about this certain thing. So that can come into it. And then you've got people like Charles Jardine, who I had somebody on the phone yesterday who was saying, what, the artwork, the pieces Charles Jardine is doing is fantastic. I said, it is, isn't it? I said, the great thing about Charles is a caster, he's a fisherman, but he can also draw it. And so he can draw what he's doing. Now, you can try and photograph that, but you can never capture it. And what you can't photograph is what's happening underwater with whatever tactic or technique you're using. You can't photograph it. But he can draw it, and because he knows fly fishing, because he knows casting, he can actually draw exactly what is supposed to be happening with the rod, the hands, the line, the fly. And so again, you've got that department which Charles can cover, which I don't think anybody else can do that. And then we've got people like Mick Huffer, who does textbook tying. He's been doing it ever since we started, and I wanted to get across in a very detailed way how a fly is tied, so anybody who picks the magazine up can see how a fly is tied. And so we do it in a lot of stages, and I think it's important that people see how a fly is tied, because I think, again, when I first started, I had no knowledge of how that worked. I didn't understand what fly tying was. And what we try and do with that is we try and make it so you can see exactly how every fly is constructed right from the very basic. But Mick, he can just do it. And when you're photographing a fly being tied with the camera coming over your shoulder, I don't know if you can imagine, it's quite difficult, because your fingers, you're having to move your arms and your fingers are in the wrong place. But he just ties the fly and it's always perfect. And these can be any flies from a size 16 dry fly to a size 2 saltwater shrimp, and he just puts them together and they always look good. It's a real talent to be able to do that. Other people that contribute to the magazine that are important to it are people like Alistair Gowans, for instance, Sally Gowans, who he's been fishing for salmon ever since he started fishing, and he knows a huge amount about salmon. And you need to have that lifetime of salmon experience to be able to judge what salmon are doing and how they react and what they do. And to speak to Ali is always an education, because he knows and has seen a lot happen with salmon that other people haven't, and he's tried a lot of different things. And so somebody like having Ali on board is really useful because of that experience with salmon. It's just another encyclopedic knowledge of salmon and how they move and what they do. And certainly as regards tackling them, I think he's second to none, to be honest. Then we've got people like Bruce Sanderson, who Bruce has always written for the magazine ever since we started, and I think there's a couple of things that Bruce really deserves recognition for, because he opened up the whole of Scottish trout fishing with his guides, which were unprecedented. They actually opened up the thousands of lochs up in the Highlands that meant that people could access those lochs and fish them. And so the work he did on that was initially very important, and then obviously because he has such an association with the west of Scotland, and he knew those places before the salmon farms arrived, there's no wonder he's so passionate about what's happened to those Western Highland rivers and Western Highland lochs, which have been ruined by fish farms. And he is the champion of campaigning against those fish farms to try and reinstate the runs of salmon and sea trout that they really should still have.
What about the angling writers you would have liked to have had on board but missed out on because of the timing?
Cool. Well, there's obviously a lot of them, to be honest, Phil. I did work with Hugh Falkus on one or two pieces for salmon trout and sea trout, and obviously he was my boyhood hero, and so that was a great privilege to work with him. I've worked with Malt Morgan as well. Sea trout was a big thing for me. But you can think of people like Sawyer, people like Cove, again, all this imitative side coming in. Skews. Skews was a great writer, so he would have been good. Richard Walker would have been good, because he didn't just write the pieces, he also got involved a bit like Skews. I think anybody who had something to contribute, anybody who produced milestone books, because that was really the only way you could get recognition in those days, to actually talk to the people and to actually, there's always more information there. When somebody writes a book, it isn't everything they know, and so I would imagine that if you would talk to any of those people, you were always going to root out some little thing that you didn't know, which they sort of pass on, which you think, well, that's a useful thing to know, and I've never really thought about that. So yeah, there's stacks of them, I'd say, Phil.
A bit of a change of mood now. At the risk of leading you into areas where you might perhaps be better off saying nothing, what are your thoughts on excavated holes in the ground filled with tailless stockies, and of people who see this as real game fishing?
I just think that fishing is an instinct and an urge that a lot of people have, and if you're going down to fish and you're using a fly and you are getting the experience, there's nothing like hooking a fish on a fly, and I think that the feeling of achievement and the satisfaction you get from that, it doesn't really diminish. What I do think is that when we were in the sort of the peak of still water fishing in small still waters, which was in the sort of late 80s, early 90s, I think we missed a trick then, and we should have said to people, this is only a very small part of fly fishing. It's very difficult to say to somebody, look, there's more to fishing than fishing in a small still water for rainbows with a goldhead damsel. There is a lot more to it. You can go and you can fish in the wilds of Scotland for brown trout. You can go sea trout fishing. You could go salmon fishing. You could go pike fishing with a fly. You could go abroad. You could be fly fishing with giant trevally in the Seychelles. I have to say that if somebody had told me that I would enjoy fishing in the Bahamas or Mexico when I first started out with my fly rod, I would have thought they were crazy, because I knew there weren't any trout out there, and I thought that's all you could catch on a fly rod. And I think that so long as we have got fisheries out there where people can go and experience fly fishing and try and get some understanding of the casting and the retrieving and how the flies work and what the experience of catching a fish is like, then that's fantastic. But we do need to make sure that they don't think that's it, because it isn't, and that's just a very, very small part of fly fishing, and there's so much more. And I think it's a shame that we had so many people doing that all those years ago, and they're obviously not doing it anymore, and yet they've probably attained the skills that they required, but they just haven't gone on to use them. And I think that is the disappointment for me, because there's no doubt about it, there are less fly fishermen around now than there were 10 or 20 years ago, and so we must have missed something. The number of people that fish on small streams now for wild brown trout is great, but that's only happened in the last few years. But it's just a small compartment of the different path you can take when you actually go fly fishing. I think they have a place, but you have to get the message across that that isn't the be-all and end-all of fly fishing. That isn't everything there is to know about fly fishing.
And the tailless stockies?
Yeah, you mentioned stockies with no fins. I really don't think there's any room today for fisheries to be stocking tailless, finless fish for recreational fishing. I don't really think it really should be done for the table market, but certainly not for recreational purposes. I think one of the things I think about fishing is that one of the privileges a fisherman has is he can catch a fish and take it out of the water and see the sheer splendour and the beauty of a fish that is freshly out of water. And I don't think anybody apart from a fisherman ever really sees that. When you see a dead fish on a slab, it doesn't possess the iridescent colours, the depth of colour, the life, the eye, the fins, the glow of a live fish. And it's a real miracle to behold. The colours of fish are amazing, but they immediately lose them within minutes of dying. So when you go fishing, you want to see a pristine specimen of fish when you bring it in.
Taking manufactured fishing one stage further, what are your thoughts on manufactured success? Venues were deliberately grown on monsters, and even records are put in which often barely see out the day.
Again, it's a really difficult one, because I'm from a school where if I caught a fish that had just gone in the day before and it was £20, I wouldn't really count it, because I know if you run a fishery, Phil, you know that certain fish you put in can come out the next day, and all that's happened is that the first person to present the fly to the fish in the right way, it's taken it and it's got caught. And so I think that probably again in those early days, that's where we made a mistake. We tried to pursue those big fish. The big fish were basically what people wanted, I think, and certainly what I was trying to do was to say, look, you've caught some fish, but there's a completely different environment you could go to, and you can still catch fish on a fly. And so the big fish thing, people will always want to catch big fish. That's the way fishermen are. I'll always want to catch a big fish, but at the back of my mind, I want it to be a wild fish, something that I know hasn't just been put in. But having said that, I think with fly fishing today, with the amount of people we've got in the country and with the pressure on fisheries, it's inevitable that you will catch fish that have only been stocked the day before. However, to have them claimed as record, you have to take that with a pinch of salt, because all that really has happened is the fishery manager has managed to grow a record fish, and yes, somebody's had to go and catch it, but that isn't really the achievement. The achievement was actually producing the size of the fish in the first place. But yeah, I do meet anglers who their ambitions are to catch a double figure rainbow, you can get caught up in that. It's a goal that you want to achieve, and I don't think there's anything wrong in that, because it gives you a target to aim for. At the back of your mind, that's the goal that you're seeking. And I'm lucky enough to be able to get into wild country and go and seek the same sort of thing in the wilds of Scotland. But not everybody can do that. There has to be an understanding that a big fish in a small water has probably not grown there in that water and seen it all and done it all. It probably hasn't been in there for very long. Having said that, there's always the chance that it may have done it. And that's the great thing about fishing. It could have escaped all those flies all that time and grown on.
You said earlier that there are fewer fly anglers about these days. As a sea angler, I can tell you that the same is true there too, and presumably also for the coarse fishing side of things. Other interests are grabbing the attention of younger people in particular, with very few coming through the ranks to replace us when we are gone. So in your opinion, what is the future of fly fishing?
Talk to anybody that runs clubs. You realise that it isn't just fly fishing. It's cricket, it's badminton, it's scouts. It seems to be that, certainly from the youth element, there seems to be a dropping off in commitment to any particular sport or club, or any of those club atmospheres that we seem to have grown up with. And so that's certainly how I sort of developed into fishing, was when I was that age. I was a coarse fisherman very young. And so I do worry about that. How do we get more youngsters into it? There seems to be a lot of work going on with people introducing people to the sport, and youngsters coming into the sport. There's a lot of initiatives going on. But obviously what isn't happening is, when I was younger, is that I could just go fishing. That doesn't happen anymore. I just can't go down to the river with somebody else, both from the safety aspect, all of the aspects of going out alone when you're younger seem to crop up, but also the other opportunities to do other things on your computer do seem to make the problem. I think it is a universal thing, and I know that there are initiatives now where we're trying to rewild youngsters, and I think that's a good thing, because I know that when I first went fishing, I didn't catch fish. I was just by a river, and I knew that I wanted to be by a river. And I think that rewilding kids and getting them outside is probably one of the major first steps we need to do. I don't think we necessarily need to have them fishing. It would help, but I do think there is a cultural shift needed, certainly with youth, to get them outside and get them to experience outdoors. And I know that they're trying to do that, and I hope that makes a difference. I also think that there is a market for fly fishing in the fact that there is an older generation which comes through, which looks on fly fishing as being something still where people may have fished when they were younger, and yet fly fishing is something they've always aspired to. And I do think there is still, we know we've got an ageing population. Well, I would hope that a lot of the ageing population, when they actually look to finish work, they are looking to fly fishing as being one of the ways that they can spend their time. And maybe we could do a little bit more from that angle as well, because certainly fly fishing, you do need to have a little bit more income, not an amazing amount more, although I always argue that in Scotland you don't need any at all. I mean, it cost me £5 to fish on my stretch of the river, which is nothing. You can't play golf for any less than you can fishing. So you would think that side of it, the older generation, you would think that there might be a potential there for increasing in fishing. But certainly from the youth side, I think we just need to get more youth outside enjoying the outdoors. And that's the first step.
When you put it that way, you're right. There really is no good reason why people on a budget shouldn't be able to cast a fly at truly wild fish. No reason too why the conveyor belt of youngsters coming through as replacements for us should also feel put off either. But unfortunately, that isn't the case, and this point has been made by many others in the past across all angling disciplines. So obviously there is a problem, but useful to have it highlighted here again nonetheless. My thanks then to Mark Bowler for sharing with us his candid views on a wide range of game angling related topics.